Welcome, class, to Chapter 1 of Leadership, Global Leadership. We're going to be talking about the overall leadership environment and how globalization has impacted leadership. So, globalization, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. In a nutshell, what it's really saying is that the world is coming together more and more, and it's acting more and more like one large economy as opposed to 179 different economies, one for each country that's out there. The formal definition is the process by which businesses or other organizations develop international influence or start operating on an international scale. Okay, so what happens is that you have a business in the United States, and the main motive for every for-profit business in America is to make more profit, is to grow. Now, we could talk about the implications of that and what are the downsides of that and what are the upsides of it. That's not really part of the conversation now, but every organization is tasked to grow. Specifically, they're looking to grow in their revenue and their income for the business owner. Okay, and those are your shareholders, your stockholders. Those are the ones that own the companies. We're talking about your larger companies, but maybe when you kind of think about shares or stocks, you're thinking about larger companies, right? But the same thing goes for small businesses. But the whole thing is that it's about some profit motive. They want to make more money so that the owners of the business can actually make more money. Well, what happens when you feel like you've saturated your current market? You have to find other markets to go to. You have to expand. And a lot of companies, especially your large Fortune 500 companies, they realize that they're going to only be able to expand their business by going overseas, by selling their products and services to people in other countries. And through that is the start of the process of globalization. So now you're a US-based company, and let's say you're an automobile manufacturer, but you're selling your cars over in Europe. You're selling your cars to London. You're selling your cars into countries in Africa, and to Asia Pacific. And you're so excited about China opening up and becoming more capitalistic because there's 1.4 billion people in China, and that's a lot of cars that you can sell to people in China. So by expanding your company and selling your products to other places, you increase your customer base. Now, you also increase the complexities of your business operations because now you have to figure out how to manufacture, how to ship products. Now you're selling more cars than ever. You have to be able to get all the raw materials, so your supply chain process becomes much more complicated. You have to figure out how you're going to do your marketing and branding and messaging in all those other countries. So that complexity increases dramatically. At the same time, countries that are in those other, companies that are in those other countries, they're doing the same thing. So it's a Japanese company, say Toyota, and now they're selling their cars in China and India, in Europe, in the European Union. They're selling to America. You have all these countries that have organizations in them that are engaging in international business. Before you know it, markets begin to set up to support that. The stock market begins to embrace that concept, and they begin to work in concert with other stock markets in other countries. And you begin to see the formation of a global economy. Not to mention, labor and manufacturing costs also begins to trade places, begins to shift from one country to another country, depending on that country's evolutionary status. So, for example, China has 1.4 billion people. That's a lot of folks. That's a lot of people who need jobs. And we all know the basic rules of supply and demand. And supply and demand says, hey, when there's a lot of supply, the price goes down. So when there's a lot of laborers out there in China, which there are, the price to hire people goes down dramatically, which means the labor costs in China are going to be much lower than the labor costs in America. Not to mention the cost of living in America continues to rise every year. So people want their wages to keep pace with that inflation. Right now, the Democrats just won the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And one of the first things on Bernie Sanders' list is to create a $15 minimum wage standard in America. So we have to think, what impact is that going to have on organizations? Well, I can tell you one thing, organizations aren't just going to sit and absorb all that extra expense. they're going to restructure, they're going to redesign. They're probably going to send more work overseas to keep their labor costs all in balance to what it was before this new $15 wage increase takes effect. Okay, all that's part of globalization. What's also interesting is that you'll find people who have a very negative perspective on globalization. There's a lot of good things and a lot of bad things, right? But some people, particularly those who are in labor-oriented jobs in America, the disenfranchised, typically these people are lower income, wage earners, middle class, lower middle class, they're in that rung, and they may have lost their jobs. And then they say, hey, my job, this company, they sent, like I work for Dell Computers, and they sent the manufacturing process for our printers over to Singapore. So all the people in Dell were told, you're going to be let go. You got 30 days to find another job in our company, or you're going to be let go, downsized, and here's a process and the severance package we'll give you for being downsized. Those people say, look, I had a good paying US job that got taken away by globalization. So they're mad, they harbor lots of resentment. Okay. On the flip side, one of the main reasons why we have items that are so low cost at Walmart, Target, and HEB is because of globalization, because of the low labor costs, that the shirt that you're wearing doesn't cost, $200. Instead, you were able to buy it for $50 or something along those lines. So there's a lot of good things and bad things, but the bottom line is that the world has been becoming increasingly interconnected. Whether it be labor, financial markets, business practices, securing opportunities for growth, the businesses and countries have become more and more interconnected, and that's what we call globalization. Perhaps the biggest driving force behind that is the internet, because the internet significantly dropped the costs associated with people communicating, sharing information, sharing data, over long distances. So leadership, that's the other big focus of this class is leadership. And leadership is defined as a process of influencing others in order to guide and provide structure and to facilitate activities and relationships in pursuit of certain outcomes and goals. The most important word in this definition, and you want to note this down because I do believe there's questions in your quizzes and et cetera about that, but the most important word in that definition is influence. Okay, leadership is all about influence. It doesn't mean that you are. There's different types of leadership. You have legitimate leadership. You have leadership by expertise. You have leadership by personality. You have lots of different types of leadership, called different leadership powers, if you will. But at the core of all of them is your ability to influence, your ability to persuade people to do something. So it's implicit that if you're a leader, that you have some type of goal or outcome that you're trying to achieve. And what you want to do is influence other people to do what you want them to do in order to achieve that goal or outcome. That's what leadership is all about at its core. Now, when we're talking about leadership in one country, where you're dealing with people from your culture, that's one thing. When you start talking about people from other countries and other cultures, leadership dynamics gets much more complex. The interpersonal aspects of leadership become much more nuanced and much more difficult. Heck, to be honest with you, to be a successful leader, even in your own home country, is challenging because you have people with different backgrounds and cultures, even within our own country. But at least we share things like a common language, a common value system, a common political system, right? We understand the cultural, idiosyncrasies for a lot of the different folks, a white person versus a black person versus a Hispanic person, or, a person who is 50 years or older versus a person who's 20 years old or older. We're roughly familiar with a lot of those differences, so we can kind of navigate them. While it's still challenging, we have a better shot at navigating them. However, what does a 50-year-old person who's from Japan look and act and think like? And how do I motivate that individual? And subsequently, what does a 20-year-old person from Singapore look, act, and behave like? And how do I motivate that person? So when we overlay the concept of globalization and the mixing of different cultures, leadership becomes much more complicated. So why study leadership? Because you want to learn how to work better with people. You want to increase your successfulness, right? You want to increase the likelihood that you'll achieve your personal and professional goals, and all that stems from leadership. Whether you choose to be a people leader, meaning that you want to be a manager, you want to be in a formal leadership position, or whether you don't want to be. Okay, either one is perfectly acceptable, but you could be a leader in both situations. There are many leaders who are informal leaders that people look to that have not been given formal authority to control and dictate and order other people around. There are 5 key components of leadership as discussed in the book, in this chapter. The first and foremost, and I argue is the most important, is influence, your ability to influence people. Second is organizational objectives. You must know what the objectives are that you're striving to accomplish. Leader followers, and this is really interesting here because we focus on the dynamic between leaders and followers. And believe it or not, you could be a good leader, but if you have the wrong followers with you, you still will be unsuccessful. You could be a bad leader and have the right followers with you and be successful. So the relationship between leaders and followers, that a leader-member exchange is kind of one of the theories, is very important in terms of being successful. Change. You have to be willing to deal with change. Some people say the only consistent thing in the world is that things will change. So this is a very important part of leadership, learning how to deal with change and learning how to deal with people. So we're going to talk about all these concepts, throughout the semester. Now, here's one thing that many of you may not have thought much about. And it is, what is the difference between a leader and a manager? Okay. And they are different. While we would hope that they would overlap. So let's take the role of a leader and the role of a manager, and then you got a person. So think of it kind of like a triangle. On one side you have leaders, and on one side you have managers. I got to put a person in one of those 2 categories. Well, what's the difference between those 2 categories? Managers have formal authority, okay, over a team, over a process, a system, but they have formal authority. As such, they can give instructions to people. But their real job is simply to manage things, to make sure that the goals, and basic things get accomplished. Whereas a leader is someone who exerts a personal level of influence over other people. So the main difference between leaders and managers is that leaders have people follow them, while managers have people work for them. So you can have no great confidence in your manager, you can have no great belief in your manager and still follow them and still comply with their dictates or their orders. But they're not a leader. They don't inspire people to want to support them. They don't inspire people to go above and beyond. Whereas leaders tend to do that. Leaders have an inspirational type of quality to them. A successful business person ideally should be both a leader and a manager, meaning that you understand how to do all the paperwork within the corporation. You understand the processes for promotion, raises, for getting work done and accomplished. You understand you understand those basic things. But then you also know how to inspire people. Okay, you know how to inspire people that are not on your team, those that are on your team to go above and beyond. See, a manager would not be able to get their employees to work overtime, but a leader would be able to. Okay, so a successful business person needs to be both a strong leader and a manager in order to get their team on board and follow them towards a vision of success. Here are some attributes of leaders and managers, so you can kind of compare the 2 to each other. A manager administrates. Okay, if they're an administrator, a bureaucrat, for example, they kind of copy the rules and regulations and instructions that are given to them. They don't think out of the box. Managers don't think differently. They don't think unique. They seek to comply, right? They imitate what they see. They look for what's the status quo, what's always been done, and then they repeat that. Okay, they're the classic quote unquote good soldier. Those are attributes of a manager. Okay, they just want things to be done right. Okay, so that's the attributes of a manager. And I'm not saying those are all bad. Matter of fact, most people in corporate America, most people you meet are going to be manager type people. Just if they were all leaders, then who would the leaders lead? They just have so most people in the world, most people in organizations, they're going to be employees or managers. But every now and then you'll see that dynamic leader shine through. And that's the person you really want to focus on. Now, a leader, in contrast, innovates. They are not original, okay? They develop new ideas. They focus on people. There's a concept that's called authentic leadership, which this is a leader who focuses on achieving his or her goals by developing their followers. So they focus, hey, I'm going to get you that training. I'm going to get you the resources you need. I'm going to make sure that you are fully empowered to be the best you that you could be. And I know as a result of that, I'm going to achieve my goals because your desires are 100% in line with my desires and my vision. So that's called authentic leadership. They inspire trust. They have a long-term perspective, not as a manager would have a short-term perspective. They rely on control. So a manager would say, for example, if you don't do this, I'm going to fire you, right? Or I'm going to dock your hours. They focus on control and punishment to get people to comply, whereas a leader focuses on inspiring people to get them to buy into the vision, and then people will self-regulate. They'll correct themselves to stay in tune with that vision. A leader challenges the status quo. They are uniquely their own individual, and they're not afraid to speak up and to let people know that. So now we're going to kind of step away a little bit from leader versus manager. So hopefully you guys have a good idea of what the two mean, and we're going to talk more about what does it mean to be to be in management today. Okay, so you can just assume that you're also a leader for this particular slide and set of conversations. Back in the day, say like 1950s and earlier, if you were a manager, or what we call a people manager, that was your job basically 100%, was just to come in and manage your team. So let's say you're building a software program. 1950s and earlier, 1960s and earlier, you would have just came in and managed the software programming team. So you yourself would not have been programming the software. You wouldn't have been writing any code or anything like that. Instead, you would have been managing the people who are doing all of that work. So yes, you would understand how to write code. You would be able to read to check it or correct it, but your whole job would be managing those people, making sure they're getting there on time, that they're doing their work, that they're operating at the quality level that's expected of them, handling any interpersonal conflicts, dealing with promotions, raises, all that kind of wonderful stuff. And then you go home, you come back the next day and you repeat that process. Well, that has changed. People are no longer just people managers anymore. Managers are expected to do work themselves as well. So the way it looks nowadays, I'd say maybe from like the late 70s on up, is that managers are also required to do technical work themselves. They're required to have the technical skills and to also use it. So managers today would be managing a software team. They're writing a particular program or what have you, and they have 5 employees. Each employee is writing a different component of the software. And now the manager, him or herself, also has a component of the software that they're writing. Okay, so managers are required to have these technical skills and implement and work right alongside their team. In addition to that, they have all the same people management skills that were expected of people back in the 1950s, 1960s and earlier. So what's important to note is that as a manager today, you should expect to also do work, not just manage people. So it's kind of like a manager has 2 jobs. Okay, that manager leader has 2 jobs, the people management side of things and also the technical side of things. Successful managers also have very strong interpersonal skills. So these are skills which refer to a person's ability to understand, communicate, and work well with others and other groups. Their ability to develop effective relationships. So here we start talking about things like emotional IQ. Your ability to recognize the emotional changes in other people and to adjust your responses to meet those emotional changes in order to achieve your goals. We got a whole section we're going to talk about emotional IQ, right? But successful managers, successful leaders, they have very strong interpersonal skills, and a key component of that is emotional IQ. And then decision-making skills. Successful managers today, they must have the ability to make decisions. Now, there is something I want to point out with this, is that successful decision makers understand that they will never have all the information necessary to make the right decision. We are talking about the real world, and it's complicated, and you never have all the information you want in order to make a decision. So you have to know how to make good decisions off of imperfect information. You have to be able to conceptualize situations, visualize alternatives, problems you may have faced, the outcomes the advantages you may face of those alternatives, and then make the right decision. And oftentimes, the word right or wrong decision doesn't really apply. You're making the best decision given the information that you have. And what you're hoping is that that information is on the better side of right. Okay. And if it is, great, congratulations, put a stake in it and continue to move forward. Successful managers understand that we live in a world of ambiguity, that we live in a world of gray. A lot of people, there are a lot of people out there I've met, and this also goes to a personality type, but they're black and white. They see things as right or wrong, yes or no, good or bad. And there's this very strong sense of dichotomy between things. You're either right or you're wrong. You're either 100% right or you're 100% wrong, right? So, but in truth, the world doesn't operate that way. Very few situations are we given that we actually have the comfort of being able to uniquely say, this is 100% right and this is 100% wrong. Instead, it's better to think of things as being on a continuum, in that something is more right or less wrong, less right and more wrong. And think of it like that. So when you're a manager and you're faced with making an important decision, or even when you're thinking about yourself, right? What college was the best college for you to go to? What was the right decision? Was Prairie View the right decision? Was it the wrong decision? We really don't know. And oftentimes, you'll never find the full answer out. We can only visualize the alternatives and think about the advantages and disadvantages associated with those alternatives. But we can never go back in time, choose a different college, and then compare those results, on apples to apples. We cannot do that. So that in and of itself lets you know the complexity of decision making is gray. It is not black and white. Okay, so managers also recognize if they made a decision that's not working out the way they expected, that they can and should change. It's so funny, but when I believe it was Al Gore and George Bush were running against each other in the election, I think it was those two people. And one of the terms that George Bush coined was flip-flopping. And that was a very successful term. They used that to politicize and called Al Gore a flip-flopper. And that was very effective. People really bought into it. You don't want to be a flip-flopper. Once you make a decision, you stick with that decision. That's what real men do. That's what real politicians do. You don't flip-flop. Well, here's the problem with that, is that good leaders, they do flip-flop. Good leaders, when they come into new information that helps them see the problem in a different way, they adjust what they're doing. So good leaders, good companies change all the time. As a matter of fact, we had in our previous slide, change is the only thing that's constant. So strong decision-making skills implies that you're always seeking knowledge and information. And if you realize that a decision that you made isn't exactly doing what you expected for it to do, then you're willing to change and make a different decision so that you can ultimately achieve the goals that you're after. So the rise of global leadership. Successful leaders today, and what I mean by successful in this term, are people that move up the ranks in corporate America are inevitably people with global experience. Okay, that's reflected here by the statement from Jack Welch, the former CEO of GE, person who's credited for turning GE around from the brink of bankruptcy to a very successful and strong, profitable company that it is today. The Jack Welch of the future cannot be like me, he says. I spent my entire career in the United States. The next head of GE will be someone who has spent time in Bombay, Hong Kong, Buenos Aires, and the list can go on and on. And I've seen this firsthand in corporate America. When I worked for a large Fortune 500 company, it was common knowledge that if you wanted to be a director or a vice president or move up the ladder into these higher levels of executiveness, then you had to at least had an international stint. You had to have left the United States and went over to another country and worked there for an extended period of time, and then come back to the US. You had to bring that international experience with you, because inevitably, many of the Fortune 500 or Fortune 1000 companies, they're operating in multiple countries. You have to be able to deal with those changes and differences. So global versus traditional leadership. All right, so most of what you've heard throughout your college career has been traditional leadership. In this class, we're going to talk about traditional leadership, but we're also going to talk about global leadership, or leading people in a global environment. Okay, so global leaders, or leaders that are facing, or people who are trying to do leadership in a global environment, they operate in a much more complex environment than your traditional leaders. And that's not, look, traditional leadership is tough on its own. Being a successful leader is difficult in the best of times, right? In your own home country. It's difficult if you're working in an organization that only sells products in the United States. So when I add a global context to it, my customers are coming from different countries. I have employees from different countries. I'm dealing with different languages, different cultures, different political environments. It is a much more complex environment, and we should not underestimate the challenges associated with that. Okay, the cognitive, the attitudinal, and the behavioral requirements that are required of global leaders significantly differs from those of people who are just domestic leaders. So here's a definition of global leadership. Okay, and it is a proper definition, um, and you'll see kind of where they change or tweak it just a little bit to fit the idea of global leadership. So R. Henson defines global leadership as a global leader is one who influences and inspires a group of people to pursue organizational objectives while fostering individual and collective growth in a multicultural context characterized by significant levels of ambiguity, uncertainty, complexity, and distance. So you can see what he's added to the definition is the idea that there's greater levels of ambiguity, uncertainty, complexity, and distance, and that the person is working in a multicultural context. Those are really the components that are overlaid on top of traditional leadership, which makes it far more complex. And we're going to discuss more of those complexities as we go through the content in chapters, the rest of the semester, and the other information I'm going to share with you guys in the class.